Okay, so can you hear me? Yeah. So we're going to open this session on Copernicus and INSPIRE. The title of the session is a win-win approach for better monitoring the implementation of European environment policies. I'm the chair. My name is Josiane Masson. I work for the European Commission, DG Environment, in D4 unit dealing with governance, environment information and reporting together with INSPIRE, but I'm in charge of Earth observation and space-related issues. So I will share this session. So it will be split, as a matter of fact, in two sessions, this morning and this afternoon. So this morning we will have a kind of overview of the Copernicus state of play. Unfortunately, the speaker from DG Enterprise, Katharina Bams, could not come, and so the presentation will be delivered on her behalf by Hans Dufourmont from the European Environment Agency. So then we have a presentation on the coordination of access to in-situ and reference data from EEA. Christine Mans was supposed also to deliver this presentation, is not yet arrived from Copenhagen, so it's likely that we will have to switch his presentation to the end. And then, so we will have two presentations focusing on the emergency management service of Copernicus, one delivered by Domenico Grandoni, who is in charge of the management of this Copernicus emergency management service, so he's a service provider. And then also a presentation by EuroGeographics on the access to in-situ reference data for the emergency management service, which is a success story, and so Saulius Urbanas from EuroGeographics will explain that. And then we have a presentation by Hans Dufourmont from EEA on the added value of reference data access from the Copernicus land monitoring service point of view. So I will start with, I would say, a short introduction. So I will switch now to yes, so the objective is just to give a kind of overview where we are and why do we organize this session now. Why? Because 2014 is a very important milestone for Copernicus. Maybe you're aware that the Copernicus regulation for the EU Earth Observation Programme was adopted in 2014 with a budget of about 4 billion euros, so it's a lot. But then also we had the launching of the first Sentinel satellite, Sentinel-1, and so we will continue. It will continue with the other satellites in the next coming years, in 2015 in particular. And also, last but not the least, we have a very important thing from the point of view of user, which is the Copernicus data policy, which was already adopted at the end of 2013, but it will be developed by Hans, which is the free, full, and open data policy. So it's very, very important contribution of Copernicus in terms of access to data, to space data, and to derived information. Because Copernicus is not only for providing space data, which is, as a matter of fact, maybe the large part of the budget in terms of satellite development. So the large part of the budget is for the space component, but we have also added value information services, which are really dedicated to monitoring and better understanding the state of environment and changes of environment at global, EU, and member state level. So how Copernicus and INSPIRE are linked, and why are we talking about mutual benefits? Because first of all, Copernicus will provide, started to provide large geospatial data sets and information which are compliant with INSPIRE. So it means that the compliance with INSPIRE was taken on board from the beginning by the services and by the space data delivery. And as I said, we have this free, full, and open data policy, which is really based on INSPIRE principles, data share, and also GeoGeos data sharing principles. So it means that those two, INSPIRE directive and GeoGeos, were really instrumental in the definition of the Copernicus data policy. But also Copernicus is for producing added value information, and for that the access to in-situ and reference data, what we call reference data, it's in the sense of your annex INSPIRE data, are particularly essential, because without in-situ data you cannot derive any added value information. And for that, Copernicus rely on INSPIRE, should rely on INSPIRE for accessing those reference data, so it's really essential. Copernicus, in Copernicus governance, the in-situ component has not a specific budget, so it's integrated in the budget of the services. So there were a lot of discussions on that in the frame of the legislative process. It's supposed to be the contribution of member states, but of course it's very challenging because there are multiple sources of information for this in-situ component, and for that there was an in-situ coordination which has been handled by EEA, and which started by with the FP7 GIS project. Maybe you heard about that, so it will continue now with the new program. So INSPIRE and Copernicus were developed in parallel. So as you probably know yourself, so they are different stakeholders. They are maybe not always completely well connected, so at member state level. So it's not always easy to have a common approach, in particular on the issue of top-down versus bottom-up approach. So there were a lot of discussion in the initial operation phase, but now I think that there are mutual better understanding on that, and we can consider that Copernicus also contributed to the development of INSPIRE, because the projects themselves, they have been involved in the development of INSPIRE, and we had also other important contribution, for example the HELM initiative and EAGLE on land monitoring, which were very well connected with the development of INSPIRE on these themes. What I would also like to highlight is that for running the Copernicus services, it's important to have in mind that in-situ and reference data have to be available with a good quality. Of course, they have to be updated, complete, and online. That's really an operational use of the INSPIRE infrastructure, which is at stake for Copernicus. And a lot of progress has been done, so it will be explained by the speakers today, but there are still to be done in terms of availability and performance, in particular regarding the near real-time access to those data. So we will explore in this session the INSPIRE benefits and remaining obstacle for a more effective implementation of Copernicus from different point of views, from the point of view of the Copernicus services from the point of view of member state representative, national mapping agencies, and also EuroGeographics. So it's important to share those views and maybe to have a lively discussion afterwards. So thank you for your attention, and now I give the floor to Hans for delivering the presentation on behalf of Katharina Bams.
So, yes. Actually, should be not put it.
So, Hans, the floor is yours.
This pointer. Okay. So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I will do my best to replace Katharina Bams. It's not always easy to replace colleagues who are actually even in a different institution. But anyway, since I have a little bit of background in GMES Copernicus, that should work fine, more or less. My presentation, or Katharina's presentation, basically will have several parts. A short introduction, then basically an overview of the state of play of Copernicus, and a part on the data policy, which I think interests a lot of people in this program. And then further on, we will move also into a few examples of what is being done in terms also of providing incentives for user uptake within the Copernicus program. So, first of all, the services that have been identified within Copernicus, there is 6 of them. It all started with, let's say, the services that basically monitor the systems of the Earth, the vertical, what we could call the vertical systems, the land, marine, and atmosphere services. And then later on, other services were added, dealing with emergency response, dealing with security aspects, and the last one, the latest one, was identified on climate change becoming obviously a very important issue nowadays as well. There's a number of years of preparatory work that has been done before we came to this full operational program, and this is a little bit reflected into quite a few FP7 projects that have been run over the years, and which served as a preparation really to come into the full operational phase of this Earth observation program. There's a lot of information available on the various Copernicus sites on the results of these projects, and actually a lot of them are effectively yielding results that fed almost directly into some of the operational applications of Copernicus. Now, as Josiane already mentioned, 2014 is quite a milestone in the program. We have had this quite long run-in phase, which was mainly based on R&D projects, and then back in 2011 we switched into what was called then the initial operations of GMES, the GIO phase. And now, ultimately, in 2014, the big green arrow, the big bulk of all the work that starts in the operational phase, where we have a perspective from 2014 up to 2020, more or less, and beyond, actually. On the state of play, what has happened so far and where are these milestones? Well, it was also already mentioned. We'll go a little bit in detail. There has been this regulation on Copernicus that has been approved, and which repeals the previous regulation from 2011 or 10, sorry, the GIO, Initial Operations Regulation. This was dated the 3rd of April, and what a coincidence. I mean, there are rumors once in a while that the Commission doesn't manage to coordinate very well with ESA and vice versa. Look at the dates. I mean, Sentinel-1 was launched also on the 3rd of April, so there is effectively some coordination for those who like to see it. Anyway, The Sentinel-1 is the first launch that we got of a family of satellites in this Earth observation program, which has capacities to see through the clouds, and therefore is very much complementary to all kinds of optical systems that are also foreseen in the same family. Let's focus a little moment on the regulation of Copernicus, where the objectives very clearly is that Copernicus should become the European contribution to the global Earth observation system of systems. That's part of the explicit objectives. Of course, the objectives go a bit further than that as well. There is a lot of things that deal with the specific European context. It's also all about capacity building in the domain of Earth observation within Europe. It's about providing socio-economic benefits for society through Earth observation. It started and remains very important that we focus on monitoring the Earth systems and working on the side of civil protection and security as well. So all of these objectives are englobed in the Copernicus regulation objectives. Since we are in the INSPIRE conference, and yet another example, there's a lot of questions that we got over the years in various platforms where people said, hang on a minute, GMES Copernicus, how does that fit with INSPIRE? And didn't we hear something about size? And didn't we hear something about yet another program? How does that all fit together? Is there any coordination at all? Well, effectively there is. I mean, there is probably much more than we tend to realize, although we agree that it's not yet, let's say, perfect. It's still human work, so it has its flaws, but at least in the legal framework, for instance, we very clearly see that there is a recital in the regulation that requires all of the Copernicus activities, mainly the services, to become fully INSPIRE compliant, whatever that means. I mean, there's a lot of technicalities behind it. There's a lot of different levels one can achieve in this compliance, but at least the legal obligation is there. There is an Article 7 as well in the regulation, and that gives a specific task to EEA on in-situ coordination. And that is basically aiming at the coordination of those in-situ data that are needed in a cross-service context. What does that mean? It means that, in principle, each of the services is primarily responsible for the collection of in-situ data that are needed for the production of that specific service. However, whenever we see that there is the same data set in situ that would be required for the land service and for the emergency service, and maybe even for a third service, whenever we see this kind of cross-service situation, that's where EEA can step in and try to facilitate so that we get an economy of scales and that we can provide better access to in-situ data. Articles on data policy, not the least important, I would say. There we link back to a delegated act from the GIO regulation in the Articles 23 and 24, where the principles, and I'll come back to that, where the principles are set out for a full, free and open data policy. Quite important. Article 26, international cooperation. The program is not closed. It's not limited to the EU 28. In fact, we open the door for participation by third countries, for instance, the EFTA countries, Switzerland as well, and any kind of third country can also join the program on the basis of a high-level agreement and a subsequent memorandum of understanding. So it's quite open in that sense. On the management side and government side of this program, there's a number of articles that say, okay, the whole thing will be run by the Copernicus Committee, and they will be assisted by a user forum in order to ensure that the program is sufficiently user-driven. On the space component side, you see that the years 2014 and 2015 are quite important, and that there is another concentration of launches foreseen in the time frame 21-22. But in essence, you see that we have quite a few satellites to be launched in those 2 years. And in parallel to that, the other unit in the DG Enterprise is working on setting up agreements with various operators of these services, as you see them listed here. All of these delegation agreements are being negotiated right this very time frame, and are expected to start within a number of months to come. So again, this parallel process between space component and service is ongoing. Now, data policy. There is this regulation, what I mentioned before, in which I would just like to highlight a few basic principles. And basic principle, the first one is being free, full and open access, meaning that we have no restriction on use nor on users in principle. There's always a few exceptions. That's inevitable, I think, in legal frameworks when security comes in and stuff like that. So you still have to read through the regulation to make sure that you clearly understand what is meant there. But the main principle, let's say the main driver for this data and information policy is really to make it as open, as full and as freely as possible, without limitation in time, without limitation in geographic extent. The only thing that is asked, of course, is to acknowledge for that and to mention appropriately wherever it's needed that the data and information is coming from the Copernicus program. Now, the scope of the policy, to what is it applied? Because what we noticed, for instance, in the discussion with contributing missions is that these guys all of a sudden stand up and said, okay, no way that you're going to distribute our satellite images for free in the Copernicus program. You're just ruining our business model. That cannot be the objective. So there is indeed a kind of focus that we have to understand correctly. The policy applies to all data generated inside the Copernicus program. And that is mainly meant on all the data that are coming from these family of Sentinel satellites, plus all the information derived from these satellite data and provided through the information services. It does not directly apply to contributing missions, so we're not ruining that business model. However, we are trying there to do some coordination to further improve and facilitate the use of Earth observation data in the same context. Yeah, the limitations, I think we can go quite quickly over that. These are the typical exceptions, and with respect of intellectual property rights of third parties and stuff like that, nothing new, I would say. These are the things that we find back in almost any of such type of regulation. But then maybe a quick word on registration. Again, there the idea was to make the access to data information as efficient and fluent as possible by lowering the access threshold. And therefore, there's no registration needed for discovery and view services. The registration on downloading the data should be a very light one. And it's only when the security issues are at stake that we might have a bit more restrictive approach to registration. But again, main objective, full, open and free. It's meant to be compliant with another series of directives that are closely linked to the whole program. So INSPIRE, the PSI directive as well, and the definition of the GEOS data core. Now, let me switch to the last part of the presentation, just a few moments, on user awareness and uptake. There's quite some incentives that are being provided by the Commission and work that is being done to make sure that users understand what are the capacities, what are the potentials of the program. I've included here a number of links throughout the various slides. Unfortunately, we won't have the time to look into detail, but as you will have access to the slides afterwards, you can explore them yourself. There's actually much more than we sometimes know, and I must admit that even though I'm part of the Copernicus program, even I discover on a regular basis new things that I say, hey, that's interesting, didn't know about that one. So let's discover this. There's a number of applications that is being developed for mobile platforms as well in the various services. The previous one from atmosphere, this one on marine services. And then there's examples of applications like the case of the tsunami in Japan, where indeed emergency services were triggered and yielded some valuable information to manage the crisis over there. Same thing with the Italian earthquake, recent earthquakes, for instance, where again emergency mapping was done. There's examples from what they call large-scale demonstrators as well, the EMEA, and there we enter into cooperation between the Copernicus program and the other space flagship program from the Commission, which is Galileo on positioning systems. So cooperation between the two there is further elaborated, amongst other, and there's many other things in these large-scale demonstrators as well. And here a few more examples to be explored, I would say, outside this session. And I think with that one, I'm coming almost to the last example here of applications where it's maybe interesting for the user side as well. ESA decided to develop some toolboxes specifically on the Sentinel-1, 2, and 3 data that will be made from September onwards. They will be made freely available as well to the user community. So, conclusions. Copernicus is entering indeed in the full operational phase. And it's meant to become one of the largest programs worldwide on integrated Earth observation systems. Very important is the data information policy. It's really an incentive that the downstream services start building upon these free data sets. It's worth investing in it because it's a long-term perspective. It's not a one-off as we had in the past many times, but this time it's really a long-term program, so you can be ensured that there will be continuity at all levels, also for the satellites, for instance, the Sentinel family of satellites. So each time with a double pair of satellites, if one drops off, you still have the other. So there's a lot of possibility, a lot of potential there, and the Commission from its side is also working on user uptake and awareness raising. And with this, I would like to end this presentation on behalf of Katharina Bams. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hans, for this very comprehensive overview of the Copernicus program and state of play. So it provides you with a good understanding of data and information policy in particular. And I think it's very, very important step forward. So it was maybe largely influenced. There were a lot of debates during the data policy definition. It was maybe largely influenced by so existing data policy such as Landsat, for example, which influence a lot. But still, it's very, very important to have those large data sets available for everybody to develop additional information at national, at local level whatsoever. So, of course, it doesn't cover, because Sentinel do not cover the very high resolution segment, so which is still the commercial part. And so in the, maybe you did not mention that, Hans, but in the GMES or Copernicus data access to contributing mission, so they are very high resolution data which are purchased, and some of them, they can be shared with member states. So it's also very important to mention that there are what we call core data sets, which are also available already now for member states. So now I will suggest maybe to take your questions at the end of the session. So we plan to have a kind of debate this afternoon, but if we have time, so we will take some questions at the end of the session this morning. And now let's move maybe directly to the presentation of Domenico Grandoni on access to in-situ data for emergency mapping, and maybe Christine Mans will arrive a little bit later, and so we will have his presentation delivered this morning. Thank you. Okay.
Okay, thanks a lot, Josiane. Okay, so in this presentation, I will bring some actually practical examples from the perspective of the Copernicus Emergency Management Service. So basically, here you will see the real life. So how a Copernicus service has requirements to access base reference data from national mapping and cadastral agencies, which is the current state of the play, which are the current opportunities, the current techniques implemented, and the needs for future development in order to, let's say, make this kind of access as smooth as possible. Because what you will hear many times during my presentation is that timeliness and ease of access is a key requirement. So, for those who don't know the Copernicus Emergency Management Service mapping in rush mode, I will give just a few words on it. So it is operational since April 2012, and in this table you can see the list of the latest activations. So actually it is not updated because yesterday we had EMSR 91. So this means that we have had 91 activations starting from April 2012. So this is more or less in line with expectations. As you can see from the slide also, the scope, the geographical scope of the service is quite variegated. So it is well, activations take place when there is a European interest on that. So it can be from a European Civil Protection Authority, it can be from the European Commission itself in case of operations abroad. So you see many activations from member states, but also activation in Central African Republic rather than in Guinea. What is let's say, common to all kinds of activations is that, well, the thing that the first output that the service is supposed to deliver is a reference map. That is basically a map that describes the situation within the area of interest before the event. That can be either a natural disaster, a man-made disaster, or any kind of other event. There is a very tight requirement on timeliness of delivery of this product, that is 6 hours after the availability of satellite data. And there are mainly two ways of preparing this reference map. The first way is to order an archived satellite image to aggregate, let's say, open data that are available, for instance, OpenStreetMap, GeoNames, Wikimapia, and so on, and have on-duty professional staff, cartographers, that are there to refine them and fill major gaps. Of course, you understand that this is not an efficient way of producing reference maps, especially inside of Europe, because this is kind of reinventing the wheel or reproducing data in a very tight time manner that are supposed and that in most cases are already available. So it is basically no sense to digitize from scratch single buildings in France or land cover data in Spain. Of course, we are aware of this since the beginning, and since the beginning we started to implement as much as possible access mechanisms to these authoritative reference data from national mapping and cadastral agencies, especially in Europe, where basically is also the main area where we have activations. But as you can see from the table, there is quite a variegated situation. So for each activation you can see whether authoritative reference data from national mapping and cadastral agencies were used, and if access details were already available. There are other cases in which the access was set up on the fly. So there was the emergency activation, and let's say the access details to data were provided right there, sometimes in less than 12 hours, sometimes in more than 12 hours. So this picture shows that some work has been done. In some cases, data are accessed, but this is not the case for all activations, and this is not yet implemented. Just to comment that also a big difference between open data that can be gathered over the internet and data from national mapping and cadastral agencies is that they are authoritative, and this is, let's say, not a secondary aspect. Okay, so within this variegated picture that is there right now, we can see that data from national mapping and cadastral agencies can be accessed right now through quite a varied mechanism. So in some cases there are OGC web services available, for instance for ortho images, because I forgot to say that we need both ortho images and base vector layers. Sometimes there are e-commerce websites. So otherwise these data are available through HTTP download, for instance for UK and Spain. In other cases, for instance, again in the UK for better quality data, there is an emergency line that you can call. In this case, you can quote Copernicus Emergency Mapping Service, and you will receive support and all the details to access the data. But in other cases also, we experience ad hoc physical transfer of both ortho images and vector data. So again, from this slide, it is evident that still there is not the possibility of implementing an easy and single access point to this variety of data across Europe. That would be actually the main requirement from the Copernicus Emergency Mapping Service perspective. So I will bring just some real examples from recent activations. For instance, this is activation EMSR 68, floods in Bretagne. So this is quite a relevant case because the authorized user of the service, that is the French National Civil Protection Authority, actually explicitly mentioned that reference maps were not required. This is understandable since they have already access to their national datasets. Nevertheless, even if we did not produce any kind of reference map, when we need to generate post-event maps like delineation map of a flood, so a map that combines base reference data and the extent of the flood observed from the satellite, we need to have access to base layers as well, since they are part of the map output that we are supposed to deliver. So in this case, we exploited the access through their e-commerce website. It was okay in the sense that we could access the website, we could select the data that we needed, both tiles of ortho imagery and vector dataset. We could download them, this is okay, but after that we needed to remap the data structure of the French national datasets into the data structure that we are currently implementing in the service. And this is actually one of the main bottlenecks, because if we need to combine data from different member states, we have to face different data models, different data structures, and I will go in more details later on, but it is evident that this is quite a time-consuming task that can be critical if performed in rush mode when there is an activation and when we have really high time pressure on us. This is another case, again this year, recent floods in southern England. So this case was rather different, since there was, let's say, no formal exchange of access details to national data sets. So we were invited to contact the UK Ordnance Survey emergency line, but since this was not tested before, there was a kind of misunderstanding. So our request was not, let's say, supported at that time, and we needed to use data from the Ordnance Survey, but just the open data that are distributed through their website, and archive orthoimagery. So in this case, since the service specification of the emergency mapping service require that single building footprints are present in the maps when mapping at scale below 1 to 10,000, this means that a significant mapping effort was done to extract all the building footprints. And actually it was useless, because these data are of course already available. But in any case, so this served as a lesson, and this access through the emergency line has been tested, and we are confident that in the future everything will be much smoother. Another example, recent mapping forest damages in Ireland. So in this case, we made a request to access reference data through the INSPIRE geoportal. We were contacted by the Ordnance Survey of Ireland that actually informed us that there was kind of downtime of their servers, and so a Dropbox transfer of both orthoimagery and vector data was arranged. We are flexible on that. This was perfectly fine. In this case, the event was from a couple of months before, so there was not that very high time pressure like it would be in the case of floods that are occurring or of an ongoing fire. And so also this, let's say, not that standard data exchange mechanism worked. Okay, now I can just comment a little bit on the extract, transform, and load effort that is needed when we deal with heterogeneous data sources, for instance, reference data from 28 European member states. So from really an operational perspective, since we started the service, we, let's say, implemented some basic rules to deal with transforming and loading into the emergency mapping service data model of reference data that were available at that time. So we are happy to do this task offline, of course, when we are not in the middle of a rush activation, when we have also penalties in case we are late. And this is the best way for us, because we can put effort during peace periods when we do not have activations and be more effective during an activation. But if we have to start from scratch, let's say if we receive data during an activation, this process is really time consuming, because you need just very quickly to understand which is the data model, how data are structured, which is the meaning and the semantic of attributes, and to properly remap them into our data model that, by the way, is not yet INSPIRE compliant. And this can lead also to 8-12 hours delay in delivering the maps. And also it is prone to errors, because since we are working under time pressure, it is likely that we can commit errors wrong understanding of the input data attribute semantics is the most common one. You need then, after you have loaded the data, to check if data representation is fine. So there is quite some fine-tuning work that is, let's say, not the best when done under time pressure. Of course, from our perspective, the process shall be as much automated as possible, and we are a great fan of INSPIRE, of course, because as an optimum, we would like to use data provided under a common data model. That would be actually the target of INSPIRE, or as a sub-optimum until we reach the optimum solution, to get, let's say, as much as possible harmonized access to data in different EU member states offline, so that we can easily and as much automatically as possible implement ETL, so that we can be much more effective during an activation. So, concluding again, we are not providing a scientific perspective. We are not supposed to do this. What we provide is an operational perspective. So we need to do a task on behalf of the Commission, that is the provision of emergency mapping services. We have very tight service level specifications, and we need to comply with them. A key input to our service, especially in Europe, are reference data that in Europe are available through national mapping and cadastral agencies. So since the beginning, in April 2012, we have noticed really a significant increase of attention from the European Commission, from the national mapping and cadastral agencies. A lot of discussion, as it will be reported by Saulius later, has been done. Licensing issues have been discussed, and arrangements are in place. So if I think about where we were when we started in August, in April 2012, a major step forward has been done, because maybe if we received an activation in April 2012, it would have been, let's say, almost impossible to access data from any kind of national mapping and cadastral agencies that had not yet published data like open data. Now it is possible, still with some technical limitations, as I exposed before, that still, let's say, have a deep impact on the service timeliness, because with this kind of access, for us it is difficult to guarantee the 6 hours delay of reference maps. In this very last table, I have presented a little bit a matrix that combines ways of accessing reference data, for instance, OGC web services, e-commerce, HTTP download, emergency line, and ad hoc transfer, with different dimensions that can affect the key parameter for us, the key performance indicator, that is timeliness of access to data, that are the human interaction required, the ease of integration into Copernicus EMS data model, the availability, and the timeliness of delivery. Of course, if I would have to pick one, there is no doubt about the choice I would make. That is basically the OGC web services, because this can, let's say, give the maximum level of automation and also the maximum level of offline work in order to generate appropriate ETL. And from the Copernicus Emergency Management Service, to conclude, the key requirement is to have access even to heterogeneous reference data from different national mapping and cadastral agencies in Europe through OGC web services, and of course, possibly through a single access point, instead of having the emergency mapping service to federate different data sources. This is the task that we are currently doing. this is a task that is out of the scope of the provision of emergency maps. Thanks.
Thank you, Domenico, for this very good presentation and for sharing your experience with the Copernicus Emergency Mapping Service from, as you said, a very operational perspective and explaining very clearly what are the technical limitations, but what are the progress and the step forward. So now we will move directly to the presentation by Saulius Urbanas, which is also on emergency mapping service, but from a different perspective, EuroGeographics. Thank
you. Good morning or good afternoon, probably for in some countries that's due to the time differences, afternoon probably. So here I like to tell you the success story of the collaboration that we had we could say now in the past, but we're still keep it ongoing. So by arranging the access of the reference data from national mapping cadastral authorities for emergency management system. So this presentation was actually made by EuroGeographics, which I'm representing, and also by European Environment Agency. Tim Haig and Eugenia Shuren were involved to the activity related with the emergency management system, so and the access to the reference data. So the role of EEA was actually to make assure that the data facilitation from the sources, so-called in-situ for Copernicus, would be available, and EEA in this activity was playing with the granted role of the European Commission. And also EEA acted as a technical coordinator of Copernicus Land Service. Well, brief about EuroGeographics. This is the Association of National Mapping Cadastral Authorities, and it now covers many organizations, and the whole European coverage is available through the EuroGeographics. So we have more than one member in some of the countries, but at least one member is available. And our aim, actually, of EuroGeographics is to achieve interoperability of our members' national land and geographical information assets. So that's why we're working within this vision for last decade. One of the important activity of EuroGeographics among his members is to maintain activities through the so-called knowledge exchange networks. And we have a number of knowledge exchange networks on quality, INSPIRE network, business interoperability policy, cadastre. And in 2011, we established the network of emergency mapping. And this network was different from other our networks, which have been consisted from the experts from National Mapping Cadastral Authority, because this was a kind of open forum for not only the individuals from NMCAs, but also experts from European Commission, from national civil protection organizations, and from the emergency management service providers like Domenico and his colleagues. So this I would say that was the open forum for discussing all ideas, and probably that one of the first time when we all were able to sit on the table and share what the issues are and what the expectations are from each other. Here on the chart you see on the right side are the results of the survey which we made amongst our members, asking what is your role in emergency mapping, and only about 10% said that they had no role in emergency mapping, but the chart represented in light blue, actually the color light blue demonstrates that they directly contribute to emergency mapping by either making maps or either participating in emergency actions, and the two-thirds of NMCAs, which is in red, stated that they are contributing to emergency mapping through national authorities. So that was obviously a very clear role that NMCAs need to agree about a common approach, contributing better for emergencies. we, by setting this knowledge exchange network, we also agree about a few surveys and activities to be done inside the EuroGeographics members. So in this activity, one of those were to make the two surveys among our members on level of collaboration amongst NMCAs and civil protection organizations, those which are acting at emergencies at national level. And then we made also inventory of available data sets that could be used for emergencies. So discussing with the Commission at the first instance and with the experts from GRC, we arrived from the point that probably we would be benefiting from quite a many different teams, but we agree that we need to go step by step. So in order to identify what are the themes have been more maintained by NMCAs and where the biggest effect could be achieved, then we made this quite a comprehensive survey and developed the database of over the 800 different data sets maintained by national mapping cadastral authorities. And also at that time we already assessed that we have certain web services in place, because that was actually the vision that in the future we should get an access through the services. So at that time, already in 2011, 2012, actually we got information that a certain remote access to the information is available. So this map demonstrates that those countries which are indicated in green, they have web services in place, so geoportals are available. And as alternative, in case the geoportal or the web service would not be fitting for purpose, the countries identify the FTP service, like download service, could be arranged as well. So we see that this picture actually was very positive and put the ground for the actions. What are the 40 actions have been? So EuroGeographics and EEA signed the collaborative agreement in November 2011 for working together in facilitating access to authoritative geospatial reference data. At that time, we already identified the issue that the access to the data is restrictive. So, and as it already was mentioned by Hans and Domenico, the access was very important. That first of all we need to get an access, the grant to use the data, and later on we need to assess the technical matters. It was a number of activities done, but as a result, positive result, realizing that agreement, we arrived to the simplified arrangements, specifically for emergency management. And I'd like to tell you a bit more the process, how we achieved that. So by signing the agreement, we have a number of events, I would say, discussing with the decision makers of national mapping cadastral authorities and the European Commission, so how the solution could be found and what arrangements could be in place. So we had a very important session at the EuroGeographics General Assembly where all directors of our members are in one place. And here I would say that was a very actually important statement made by a number of director generals that this is the system where our contribution could save lives. And it is almost crime, actually, not provide data for the activities which benefit the society. So, and since September 2012, then Director Generals assured that their staff will be engaged properly, and we need to find a solution, even if that little bit maybe contradict with some of national legislations, but we need to contribute properly. So then we arrived with a solution like to get agreement by letter. So it's like a license agreement for using the data, but it was very, very much simplified and distributed by letter from EuroGeographics, signed by President of EuroGeographics, and from Environment Agency side, the head of Environment Agency, acting on behalf of the Commission. So in this was very positively received by NMCAs, and a number of NMCAs signed that letter as an agreement. So, and in 2013, we have been able to benefit from that agreement, getting access to the data and services. So, what are the priorities have been set up? So, from out of those different teams that have been measured through the survey, the experts from Joint Research Center identified that the most beneficial teams for emergencies would be orthophoto, raster topographic data, maps, and georeference vector data. data and digital elevation models. So for the first instance, we have been focusing to grant an access to this information. The letter, content of the letter was that data providers agreed to give a free access to the data for emergency management service, and it was the assurance that this data will not be used for any other purpose than emergencies. So European Commission actually guaranteed through the signature of the EEA that the terms of use will be respected, and we have never doubted that these terms would be breached at the time of collaboration. So we received the answers, positive answers from 33 member organizations. So the 24 European Union countries and 5 non-European countries agreed to provide an access to their data, and only five made some kind of statement that they have difficulties to sign that agreement. You can see those on the maps. On the map, those which agreed to provide an access, and of course, they have been operating in different technical regimes and in different capacities. But in general, the grant for accessing the data was already received. What the issues were actually faced? The main issues was not really financial issues. The main issues were more legal issues, or the processes which are described in rules and regulations nationally, which have been NMCAs have difficulties to deviate from that process. So this was quite important to consider. And of course, we had technical issues that, unfortunately, INSPIRE was still under development. There was not possible to get a number of web services from NMCAs. So the web services were still under development. So despite the technical issues, which I don't want to go to details, the main barrier was that the services were not available, were not in place. So of course now the situation is improving, and we have much better picture if we would analyze the current situation. Then we had a very interesting event in European Environment Agency on monitoring matters in spring 2013, where representatives of all different Copernicus services have been discussing the monitoring matters, and those conclusions which were written there were not written by EuroGeographics or its members, but were written by audience of Copernicus major stakeholders and users. So the conclusions actually were such that, fortunately, in Europe it is like that we're operating in very different, diverse landscapes. So the countries are on the different speed and on different setups. So, and this of course need certain coordination that will move in the same direction faster. Important statement was made that the coordination does not require big funding. Big budget is not an issue. It's important to have a very targeted coordination. So that's the biggest value for achieving the result. Of course, funding is important. Funding helps in many cases, but it was not the major barrier in this case. So also the conclusion was the arrangements with EuroGeographics members organizations have significantly improved the access with the authoritative spatial data, and it was also acknowledged that the collaboration through the associations of the certain user domains like EuroGeographics in the mapping domain is very beneficial for the activities. So what next, actually, considering those positive responses, that we still keep on going the activities in Emergency Knowledge Exchange Network, but at the last meeting of Emergency Knowledge Exchange Network, we agreed that these body need to be transposed now to the Copernicus knowledge exchange networks, which mean that we need to go beyond emergencies. We need now to discuss about the other requirements for the Copernicus services, and we need to find the way, or probably at least try to find the approach where the modern emergency services could be served by the access to the reference data. Also, we have considered that certain new methods for mapping and new data coming from different techniques like UAVs or airpass, that's the vehicles which provides information about the ground quite fast. So, and the examples have been very much elaborated by Swiss Topo, Swiss National Mapping Cadastral Authority, and we agree that certain research will be made by EuroGeographics Joint Research Center and EuroSDR. I grabbed actually this slide by closing my presentation from one of the slides made, I think that was made from Hans Dufourmont in 2012. So the guidances have been provided where Copernicus should move, where Copernicus in-situ data policy shall move. And it is obvious that the current strategy, or set up in 2012, which I believe is still valid, and the implementation is to minimize these top-down approaches and to enlarge the possibility from bottom-up approaches. Means we, by developing more services, by making more data available to society, we have a possibility now to take more information from the source which is maintained nationally from member states. So, and in this respect, actually, we have been developing the European location framework, which was actually considered as the next step how to simplify the access for Copernicus in terms of in-situ data. And it's very clear guidance that within the Copernicus, we need to consider and assess the requirements from Copernicus. So we'll do all the best that the web service would be in place, and we'll try to reach the as wider coverage as required for the services of Copernicus. So if you like to know more about ELF, please visit the website of ELF and see the showcase in locationframework.eu. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Saulius, for providing this perspective of EuroGeographics and presenting the success story and the good collaboration between EEA and EuroGeographics to facilitate the access to in-situ data, starting with emergency services. So there are, of course, obstacles, but it's really a success story because member states accepted to play the game, and so it was really a first step in the collaboration and coordination with member states. And as you said in conclusion, so you have in mind to extend that to Copernicus at large, and maybe to extend to other services, which is a very good point. So now I suggest maybe to move directly to the last presentation by Hans Dufourmont, which will give another perspective concerning the Copernicus Land Service. Thank you, Hans, for coming again. So I've just been informed by Hans that unfortunately Chris Tienmans cannot join, but Hans will try to deliver some key messages regarding the coordination, in-situ data coordination.
Yeah, me again. Okay, next presentation, our experiences with in-situ in the land monitoring service. And as Josiane just announced, I got a text message from Chris. He got blocked in transport somehow. So he asked to include a few words on what he intended to bring on the future challenges we see in situ coordination. Now, Saulius brought us a success story. In situ access for land monitoring is a bit less of a success story. I would call that work in progress. Yeah? There's an awful lot of things to be done there, but we're hopeful. Things are moving in the right direction. Let me start the presentation with just one slide, the overview of the portfolio as it stands today within the land monitoring services, where we have our traditional flagship product, well known by many of you, the Green Land Cover series of products, which is repeated every 6 years, and where we are now in the phase of finalizing the 2012 reference year of the data set covering the full EEA 39 countries. We had quite some issues still at political level, as usual, but we seem to manage to overcome these and find some creative solutions so that at the end of the day, by beginning of 2015, we should indeed have this complete 39 countries covered with Green Land Cover. Now, next to Green Land Cover, which you see as a background mosaic there, at the right-hand side, you have the series of what we called high-resolution layers on thematic characteristics of land cover themes. And there we have basically 5 high-resolution layers defined. There's one on the level of sealed soil that we call imperviousness. There is one on forest, which is mainly 2 actually. It's tree cover density is one sub-layer, and the other layer gives you a view on the forest types. Then we have a layer on grasslands throughout Europe, and then 2 more, one on wetlands and one on water bodies. Mind you, the one on wetlands, I'm going to repeat that many times over and over again. There is some confusion there. Some people think it's about wetlands in the ecosystem sense of the word. No, that's not it. It's wetlands as we can detect it using Earth observation methods, which is a fairly different thing. So keep that definition in mind. That's for the portfolio on high-resolution layers. These are repeated every 3 years, and that's also the reason why we started these data sets. Is double, actually. One element is that our customer DG, being DG Environment, wanted to have more frequent updated information. So instead of every 6 years green, we now go to every 3 years, and in the future we hope to further improve that. The other thing is that Green has relatively low resolution, in the sense that the minimum mapping unit is 25 hectare, whereas here in the high resolution layers, once they are validated, it's going to be 1 hectare raster product. So that changes a little bit the perspective. Then we have in the land portfolio 2 more products that are in the pipeline. One is Urban Atlas, which is in its 2nd run, and where the first one delivered already a coverage over 305 major urban cities, urban areas in Europe. And now we are extending that. The product is quite successful. There's quite some user uptake, and DG Regio, who is sponsoring this, decided to raise it and to come close to 700 larger urban areas throughout Europe, meaning that all in all, we will cover close to 1 million square kilometer with this 2nd release of Urban Atlas. That's quite a bit if you know that the total area we're talking about here, EEA 39, is roughly 6 million square kilometer. So this product is beyond a local component, I'd say. Obviously, working in remote sensing means you inevitably have this combination of space data with in situ data. So in our grant agreements that we established with all the countries for working on these data sets, we asked also to provide access to some key in situ data sets that are needed for purposes of training the classifiers, verification enhancement, validation of the data set, and so on. And as you can see from the list here, the numbers are there on 24 project plans. Let's say roughly about half of the countries were willing to provide access to these data sets for the land monitoring purpose. So that's That's a somewhat lower figure, I would say, as compared to the emergency response system, which is normal in a sense. I mean, Saulius correctly pointed out, when there are lives at stake, it becomes a different story. Yeah. So, and we have this a little bit less here in the land monitoring situation. Hence, some less participative figures. Now we played also a little bit easygoing, being the EEA, in the sense that we shifted a lot of the load to get access to the data to the shoulders of our service providers, who we contracted to produce some of the data sets. And so these guys got stuck in finding the access to the in-situ data. And some guys did a terrific job. They spent quite a bit of resources into getting access to the data, and yeah, to a reasonable extent they were successful as well. If you look at the results that they are providing, it clearly shows that they have been using valuable in-situ data. Nevertheless, we're still facing the issue of having partial coverages throughout EEA 39, and of course there's different levels of fitness for purpose, I would say. So despite all the statements in the legal framework, both in INSPIRE and in the GIO regulation, where we understood, and we support as well this point of view, that member states are very keen on providing access to in-situ data. That's the theory. The practice is a slightly different story. Okay, we're not there yet. There's still some work to be done. So we did, in parallel to what we had in the land monitoring service, we did a few more exercises. And one of the exercises comes from the JISC project, and was linked also to a request that was launched, forgotten meanwhile in which year, 2012-13, I think, in the user forum, in the GMES user forum, where the issue was to get access to the so-called group of reference data for the purposes of the Copernicus services. And there you see the map where we try to get access through various mechanisms. We had the grant agreements established by the countries for the land monitoring services. That's the brown-colored countries. And actually the brown-colored should cover the full EEA 39. Then we had, on top of that, we had some country visits that were done by the JISC project, addressing specifically the stakeholders that are managing these data sets, and trying to get agreement with these guys for access. And then on top of that, there was this inquiry to access the reference data, which was done following a request, the GMES user forum. This here is just one of the maps that were produced. There were several in these days, where you see the results, and where indeed you can notice as a conclusion that it's kind of a heterogeneous pattern in terms of results. And there are, as usual, there are excellent pupils in the class. There are some that would like to follow but are not capable of following, and then there is the mainstream that say go with the flow. If there's an obligation at some point, we will then establish and we will follow. So a very heterogeneous pattern is still what is happening in practice. Okay, that was the, let's say, the experience from JISC related to land monitoring. We had another exercise. Towards the end of the JISC project, we thought, okay, there's ample information available on in-situ data through what the countries report in the framework of INSPIRE, monitoring and reporting. So let's have a look at these reports, and let's just do some checks, some reality checks. Let's go on the web. Let's see if the URLs that they provide, if that indeed functions or not. And that was the next exercise, where I can show you as well a few results. Of course, it did not cover full teams of INSPIRE. At that moment, we simply didn't have the resources to do that, so we selected a few sub-teams. And it was also not covering all of the countries, but still, it was quite useful to do the exercise. whereby we try to address various sources to get the knowledge about what URLs would be available where we can get the access to the data, and then see if effectively simulating of being a Copernicus service provider, if I try that URL, do I get through or not? Yeah? These are some simplifications we applied, some criteria. So we basically focused on the road network and on the hydrology pattern. We also did some criteria to simplify the selection of network services and the selection of URLs. And in order to know in the end what is really useful for the Copernicus service providers, we had to have a view on the gap analysis, so meaning that we had to match really what were the service requirements versus what is being found on the web. We used as well a lot of data. Donnie will recognize for sure this kind of table, Claire as well, from the early INSPIRE days. So we tried to use really all kinds of sources we had available to see practical results for these two teams. And so the end result is that we had 98 records collected for road networks and 60 records for rivers. Where it comes interesting is in this map, where you see the distinction between the results for view services and download services, and where we have various categories of availability of the services in principle on paper, represented by the colors in the maps here. And then you have these red and blue dots there, and the red ones are the ones where the connection for one reason or the other simply failed. The blue ones are the ones where the connection worked. By the way, we tested these connections using both open source and proprietary GIS software, so it was a double game. But you see, it's not a full coverage. And so being a service provider at the Copernicus side, having to deal in the land monitoring with 39 countries, a complete coverage, I have an issue here. Yeah? There's still some work to be done. Similar pattern for a download service. I would say there it's even more tricky to get the access that we need as of today. So there's a few lessons to be learned. I've listed them briefly here. But mainly what we, in essence, learn is that we have to be careful between what is being reported on paper and what is available in practice on the internet. There's a clear difference there between, you know, it's different games. It's really different games. So we have to be a little bit careful there. So it's worth a check. And that brings me to the slide that Saulius already brought on challenges and the way forward in access to in-situ. Because there's been a lot of discussion on should we go for distributed access to the national and regional data fully according to the INSPIRE principles. Well, from EEA perspective, we clearly say yes, that's an obligation within the INSPIRE directive. We don't doubt about this obligation, and that's really the long-term way forward. At the same time, and now I put my hat of Copernicus service coordinator, where DG Enterprise says, guys, next year I want to see that full 39 countries coverage. Yeah, I need it. So how are you going to deal with that? And so for me, the question is not, is it a matter of choice between accessing national and regional data sets in a distributed architecture, or is it alternatively an option to say, we forget about this distributed access and we fully go for a centralized approach whereby we simply produce these pan-European data sets whatever we need? That's not the issue. The issue is that there's two contradicting requests there, and that we have to find pragmatic solutions to solve it. So for me, the issue is really a matter of having these two tracks in parallel for a number of years to come, whereby, very clearly, the final objective is to move towards this distributed approach. That's the way forward. But for the time being, and again putting that hat of the Copernicus service, I cannot wait until 2019, the theoretical end date of implementation of INSPIRE, to say, okay, now we're there. And I stop my service production until 2019, until everything will be finished. So we need to move on there. The two in parallel. That is why we have set up a number of activities where we continue our work for the coming years. And right now we are in a kind of bridging phase between the JISC project and the full operational phase of Copernicus, whereby we work specifically on reference data access. And when you see that in the description of the amendment to our delegation agreement with the Commission, we have effectively these two tracks implemented. We have the development of this CORDA system, which will provide a single point of access to the whole bunch of national and regional data sets that Copernicus services do need. That's our role. That's something we will further develop in the full operational phase. But at the same time, we cannot afford to have gaps in our coverage. We cannot afford to have too complicated things with non-harmonized data sets and what is there. Yeah? So we will also still continue that track of the centralized pan-European data sets. There's no doubt about that. We have to combine the two. They are not contradictory. They are complementary. Okay? It's a matter of finding the right balance. That links also, and here a few words on what Chris intended to tell, that links also to our future tasks in the full operational phase of Copernicus, whereby the idea is to start working really on this cross-service coordination to improve the access to in-situ data. Furthermore, we will, of course, continue to maintain the overview on the requirements from the service provider's perspective, on what they really need in terms of in-situ data, so that we can do a good matching between the requirements at one side and developing what needs to be accessed at the offer side. And then furthermore, at the last item, we will support the Commission in situ related topics. But at the same time, as I said, we have here two examples, the EU Dam and the EU Hydro. We continue to work on that. Very quickly, a few last slides on the concept of this central point of access that we are developing. Jan Blikkie, I saw him in the room before. He has left, meanwhile, apparently. But he's the guy who is working on the development of this concept. So for the service providers, it will be more comfortable to find the access. And that's how it will look like in practice with a simple example here. But at the same time, also continue to work on some of these pan-European data sets. And that brings me to my conclusions and some recommendations. So our implementation provides first components really of distributed access to in-situ data, but there's pretty much work still to be done. As I said in the very beginning, and that closes the circle, it's really a work in progress. That's the reason why we will continue to defend a dual-track approach in a very pragmatic way, to make sure that we follow what needs to be done on the INSPIRE front in terms of implementation of the distributed access, whilst ensuring that at the Copernicus site, services are not totally blocked by things that are not yet sufficient developed. And that brings me more or less to the end of this presentation. Yes, thank you very much.
So thank you, Hans. Thank you, all speakers, it gives a lot of food for thought, I would say, and a lot of information as well. So I would like maybe to give you the floor. If you have any questions, particular questions regarding these presentations, do you have? Yes. Okay, so I will.
Thank you very much. I have a question to Hans. In your presentation that you gave on behalf of Chris, you showed a map of that reflected the experience that you had in accessing the data. Is that map a map of infringements regarding the INSPIRE directive and the INSPIRE Legal Act?
Well, that's a tricky one, Paul. I can tell you several things about that, but let's say the official position of EEA is that, first of all, as you know, our agency works very much with the countries through EINET. So we believe much more in a cooperative model than in any kind of conflictuous model. And that's why I would be very cautious in saying that this is a map of infringement. Although, let's say, the tests have been done quite thoroughly, and it's not a kind of snapshot of one single moment, but in those cases where it didn't work, the people who worked on this exercise repeated it several times, tried to contact also some of the instances behind it. So I'm rather confident that the facts are correct in the analysis that has been done. Now, using this as a case of infringement, I consider this honestly beyond the scope of the tasks of EEA. That's something where I think honestly, and I'm looking now to the direction of Hugo, this would be, no Hugo, this one, yes, very much, in the front row here. This is something that I would consider within the scope of DG Environment, who is the responsible policy DG for the INSPIRE matter. And therefore, the only thing we can do is simply say, look, these are the facts, these are the fact findings. And that is what we are living when we are trying to access these data. There's a number of cases that don't work. And that's where it stops on our behalf, up to the DGs to decide if they want to do something with it.
Okay, just a follow-up remark. My suggestion, before investing in pan-European products in parallel to what the member states are supposed to provide, I would perhaps invest in making sure that member states are actually following the INSPIRE regulations and provide the data that you need for your services. That's my perspective. Thanks.
So I don't know if you want to react, Hugo, on that, or?
Yes. Well, obviously, what we witness here is indeed, let's call it an infringement of an obligation which should be in place. It's not that we are looking for confrontations. It's certainly a matter of teamwork here. But before we undertake action, a pre-infringement procedure, we need to know the facts. And there are two moments that the Commission can launch such a procedure. Either it's that we receive a complaint or that we take an own initiative. In this particular case, it's not so that the EEA has complained to us and provided us with these facts so that we take official action. Why not? Because, like Hans said, they are looking for a more constructive way forward. On the other hand, EEA is acting also in support of our colleagues in DG Enterprise, and of course they also would like to see, as Hans pointed out correctly, that this fundamental service to protect our citizens and our assets is fully operational in due time. So given the facts that we have, we will have to consider in the follow-up of also this conference what we, Commission, are going to do as our own initiative in pointing out to the Member States certain obligations which they have adopted themselves. Thank you.
So, any other question? No? Yes. Okay.
Merci, Josiane. I'm Wolfgang Steinmer from German Space Agency. I'm a great friend of Copernicus. I could help launching it in the early days, but I'm also a friend of uniform European GI data sets because I see there is an increased demand of using such harmonized data sets. And the use of Copernicus land data in particular was discussed several times in the past days during this conference in several workshops. And there were complaints, okay, I'm always informing what's available, but there were complaints about slow release of the data by the EEA. And that was explained with quality problems. Maybe they're related to what you were just explaining, but they can also be related to technical difficulties, that maybe rocky soil is confused with built-up areas in some areas. The recommendation would be not to withhold the whole European data sets for a problem which occurs in a small area. So towards a more pragmatic way of releasing the data as soon as possible. Thank you.
Hans, you react on that? Huh?
Yeah, thank you, Wolfgang. To react on that, we are aware that it's rather slow release, certainly of the official data. Now, you have to take into account really several aspects on that. It is quite a complex production chain, starting with the acquisition of the satellite imagery, where we need to have full coverage of EEA-39, 10,000 of rapid eye imagery, more than 3,000 IRS images to be acquired. The idea was that ESA would acquire in 2011 1/3 of the data, 2/3 in 2012, and that 2013 would be used as a gap-filling year. Okay? In practice, what happened is that we had a pattern of roughly 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. So it was only at the end of the acquisition season 2013 that we almost had a complete image coverage and that our work could start on the production of the information services. From the country's perspective, countries say, okay, we're willing to contribute, but please don't push it too far. We're not going to split up this work into 3 distinct packages. We just want to do it on condition that you can provide us the full territory at national level and that we can process it in one go. Meaning that in many countries we had to wait until indeed the service providers had finished their production part on the HRLs, for instance, and that then the countries could start working on verification and enhancement. That's the second element. Third element is that in the very start of this delegation agreement we had with DG Enterprise, there were quite a few discussions also at the legal side. That takes also time to make sure that the arrangement is watertight and that everybody agrees on that. There we lost something like 4 or 5 months. Fourth element, also on our side, within the GIO land team, this was a new experience with the high resolution layers. There was a lot to be developed, actually, and so it takes time to make sure that we get these things on track. I'm confident that for the next run, the 2015 run, that we will be in a much better position to make sure that it gets more smoothly. But the key element remains, whether we like it or not, the key element remains, when do we have the full image coverage available? That is supposed to improve quite drastically as soon as we will have the Sentinel-2 data up and running, and that should really improve this pace. On the other aspects, we are working. Having said all this, for those people who need access to the data, it depends on what type of access, but all the HRL data are today already available on land.copernicus.eu for viewing purposes. The download will follow beginning of next year once everything is fully completed, integrated, and validated as well, because we need to validate the data before we start distributing this. In the meantime, for all those who really need an urgent access to the data, on an ad hoc basis, on a request-by-request basis, we make the data available, provided that the potential user is willing to sign a one-page kind of license form whereby we basically say, okay, we cannot possibly take any responsibility on the quality yet until validation will have taken place. So be aware that you're working with intermediate products. That's all, and we make it available. Okay?
Yes, just to add something on that, in the land monitoring service, we really try to implement these both approaches together, the decentralized and the centralized. And so there is this centralized production, and then through IONET, member states participate to the production, as it was in the past in core inland cover. So we try to keep this approach as much as possible, but it has a cost in terms of coordination, in terms of timing, so EEA has a lot of work to do with that. Regarding the space data, which are still the main bottleneck. So we hope it will improve with the Sentinel data. What we would like to have is more dynamic monitoring, maximizing the use of all this information which are going to be available. That's really the long-term objective. But of course, in some countries where we have cloud coverage with optical imagery, we will face always a problem. So that's where maybe we need also to develop, a different approach for combining satellite data with other type of data, as already discussed and presented in the emergency mapping service, where we have airborne data, where we have UAV. So of course, for full pan-European coverage, it's maybe not adequate, but we have to combine all possible sources of information. The objective being to have a proper monitoring of environment at the end. That's the final objective of the users, and be able to use that also in terms of reporting, surveillance of environment, and so on and so on. That's the idea. Thank you. So I don't know if anybody else has. We have time for maybe one additional short question. So no, nothing else. So you're hungry, maybe. Oh, sorry. It's
not maybe the question, it's more comment. I think that for me, when I hear this top-down approach applied by EEA, it's really sad, because I know that the data which will be delivered by top-down approach, EU Hydro, for example, EuroDem, so they are available at national level. The data is available. So just the data is in the probably form which is not consistent yet for the European coverage. And that is really sad, that instead of making more efforts in this, for example, the nice coordination framework that the EEA has via IONET and other public authorities, you actually, EEA has announcing the tender and asking private sector to deliver some product which has no market future, which has no maintenance, which in a way will be delivered in some kind of contradicting with the national products. So I understand that we're in the transition period. That might be changed in a few years, but I would really urge that EA would go more on the INSPIRE compliant way for delivering the data, instead of ordering something which later on is a lower quality. And still member states need to be engaged to validating that product, to improving that quality, which for me is really duplication of work.
Sorry, I must defend EA. I'm a border child, and I saw significant deviations in your data set from reality in border areas.
To complement on that, I mean, it's the weeks of the World Championship, and if you put the football in front of the goal, then I just have to roll it into the goal, of course. It may very well be true that the data sets, that many data sets exist at national and regional level. We have no doubt about that. Yeah, we know that. The thing is, how do you get access to it, and how do you get access to it in at least harmonized license conditions? a thing which is for us very important. As you know, EEA has a data policy which is from the very start, back in '94, it was decided full, open and free dissemination of any product that we are bringing to the community. So that is our issue. We cannot afford to say for collection of all these data, we have to deal with 39 different, I may be exaggerating, but let's say over 30 different license mechanisms. We have to have this harmonized license conditions, which, by the way, is also an obligation in INSPIRE, Article 17, Para 8. Yeah? It's not yet there. We are still struggling with that. There's a lot of issues on harmonization of these data sets and. So there's a lot of practical issues where we see that, unfortunately, we have not yet reached this ideal, which we also defend, and by the way, in which we invest more than in the other part, to be clear on that budgetary-wise. But we haven't seen yet that the final result is there. And there is the urgent need from the service providers at Copernicus side, ourselves, land monitoring, atmosphere service and others, to have access to the data to produce their services today, not within 5 years. And that's why I say we need these two tracks in parallel, knowing that one is fading out, yes, and that the other is fading in, yes, but it's a temporary situation, and it's the only pragmatic solution to ensure that we can cope with both requirements, the one from the INSPIRE side and the one from the Copernicus side.
So thank you very much for this final touch. So this afternoon we will continue this session with other presentation on ocean part, on atmosphere as well, and other presentations. So if you can come, so you're welcome. And I would like to thank you for your participation.